All right, thank you everybody for coming to this week's seminar, sort of inaugural seminar of this season. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Yaquan Chang. She comes to us from ETH Zurich, where she recently, in 2024, completed her PhD with Loic Pellissier, and is now currently doing a postdoc in sort of like an affiliated lab group. Prior to that, she was a master's student at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. And prior to that, she was an undergrad in Nanjing University, during which time she actually did she was a visiting student at the University of New Brunswick. So we're really fortunate to have Yaquan here. It was kind of a serendipitous. She was coming through Chicago to attend a conference, and so I kind of enlisted her to give this talk. She's done some really interesting work relating patterns of species richness to landscape features beyond the usual of just looking at correlations with things like climate and temperature. So she's done some work that's just really impressive in both the spatial scale and also the spatial resolution of which she's using species distribution models to get very fine-scaled patterns of species diversity in the entire flora of regions like the Hengduan Mountains, and relating it to not only static landscape features, but inferences of like the dynamic nature of landscapes through geological processes, as she'll tell us about, and relating it to patterns of biodiversity and the processes that generate biodiversity. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Yaquan.
Okay, thank you, Rick, for the nice introduction and the invitation. Okay, good. So hello, everyone. I'm Yaquan, and today I'm going to talk about something about the tectono-geomorphic processes in shaping the plant biodiversity patterns in the Hengduan Mountains. So as Rick said, my background is ecology. So I'm a pure ecologist, biologist. But during past 5 years, I'm kind of struggling and thinking about do plants care about geology, and trying to bridging these two fields. It's a very long journey, and so far I can say the answer is yes, but we are still at the very beginning of this journey. And actually, I'm not alone in this journey. And more people from ecology, biology, and geology field come to talk with each other and think what geological processes may shape the biodiversity patterns that we see today. And they are using the floras, faunas, and even amphibians, fish, to study these processes. Actually, this topic exists even before these disciplines breaks. And at that time, these scientists are called naturalists. So here I want to first introduce the pioneer naturalist called Alexander von Humboldt. He is a German naturalist and started expeditions to the Americas around 200 years ago. And he went to one of his most famous trip is to the Chimborazo, Ecuador. And there, he climbed the mountains and recorded what plants he found during his journey, as well as some surrounding environmental characteristics, such as temperatures or the boiling point. And after this journey, he realized nature is not deadly aggregated. Actually, everything is connected. That's a big finding in his time, because at his time, most naturalists are just trying to only collect the specimens and identifying new species. But he is pave a way to ask this fundamental question in biogeography, which is what grows where and why. So after 200 years, with rapid accumulation of data and technique development, here we can map very high resolution plant biodiversities at the global scale. And we can see the biodiversity patterns, they are not evenly distributed. Some places are very species rich, while some places have very few species. When we overlay this pattern with the mountain ranges, we can find the mountains is the center of the biodiversity hotspot. And why is that? So there are several classic hypotheses to explain this pattern. The first is the species-area relationship, which means if we go to larger places, we can find more species. It's pretty intuitive because they have more space. The larger areas can host larger populations, and then they will increase the speciation rate. And another one is the species productivity relationship. So the productivity means the resources that species can use. And for instance, in tropics, they always have higher productivity. And then they may have they may sustain larger populations and have high mutation rates and leads to high speciation rate, and finally ends in higher number of species. And the last one is the richness heterogeneity relationship. So that means if a place has more different habitats, they may just filter different species to coexist, and that may lead to very high beta diversity. That means to what extent the species change across time or space. And then at the regional level, we can see a very high diversity. However, when we use these predictors to explain the biodiversity patterns, we can still see large residues still left after controlling these impacts. And these positive residues are mainly concentrated in the mountain regions. So that means there are something special in the mountains, and what it could be. So here we raise up several hypotheses. The first, we call it as the habitat creation process. So that means a new habitat are developed during the geological timescale through the uplift or erosion process. And then this novel habitat can allow species to colonize and diversify. And one example of this hypothesis is in the East Tibetan Plateau. And here, people can reconstruct the tectonic uplift history of the region and found, and as well as plant diversification histories. And they found that this uplift period is strongly associated with the high speciation rate during the geological timescale. And another process we raise up is called habitat disruption, because the mountains are not always grow, and sometimes it's just like stay there without changing of the total elevation. But on the other hand, these very localized geomorphic processes may raise up barriers for species, and then leads to the allopatric speciation. For instance, maybe the formation of the river valleys may cause the dispersal barriers. And these processes has been tested in fish communities because the rivers can have a lot of reorganizations, and these reorganizations may cause this temporal connection and the fragmentation of the fish community, and finally leads to higher diversity of the fish. And one case study of this mechanism is in the Hengduan Mountains. So here, people found there are two major bedrock types, metamorphic rock and sedimentary rocks. But during the time the erosion happens, and this erosion leads to more sedimentary rocks formed, and these changes of the bedrock types may cause a dispersal barrier for the fish communities. So they use this fish as case study and to look how the topology of their intraspecific diversity changes through time, as well as how the connectivity of this tributary changes through time. And they found that they have very consistent pattern. And another case study conducted in our research group is focused on the Madagascar. And here they use the plant species in the Madagascar and map very high resolution biodiversity map. And what they found is in the east of the Madagascar, even within same elevation band, you can see some very abrupt species changes. And on the same time, in the Madagascar has very famous escarpment process. So that means the high plateau of the Madagascar is retreating towards westwards. And during this retreat process, they form a lot of interfluvium ridges. And these interfluvial ridges may cause dispersal barriers for the species dispersal, and finally leads to this segregation pattern in the east escarpment place in the Madagascar. So to test these two hypotheses, we need very high resolution biodiversity data. And so the main data we can have is either we record what species we found in each region from the floras, or we can do some community survey to really look at what species actually occur. But the sampling of the species data is highly uneven, and some places, for instance, Europe or US, they have very high biodiversity, high resolution biodiversity data, but for some regions like in China, they have much sparse distribution. And one approach to solve this problem is using some statistical modelings. And here I would like to introduce a species distribution model, which uses the species occurrence data as well as their surrounding environment to build up a statistical relationship and then to map to the whole landscape to see where species actually occur. And then we can get a much smoother pattern of where species can occur. And another approach I've been using is called environmental DNA. It's just collect the DNA from the environment, either water, air, or soil. And after that, we can extract the DNA from the environment and then to see what kind of species living in this environment. And so in the Hengduan Mountains, it's very special because it's one of the main biodiversity hotspot outside of the tropics, and it's the most important temperate biodiversity hotspot. And on the other hand, the geology of the Hengduan Mountains is also very special due to the collision between Eurasia and the Indian continent. And this collision between Eurasia and the Indian create very dynamic landscape there. And here you can see the elevation range from 0 to more than 6,000 meters. So they have very high elevation gradient. And on the other hand, this region is dominated by the tectonic faults. So the fault is the fracture in the Earth's crust, and it reflects the relative movement between different rock masses. So it shows this region has a lot of movement on the Earth's crust. And what does it mean? The different types of the tectonic faults may create may cause the dynamics of the landscape. For instance, this thrust fault, they may cause the mountain uplift, so the mountain grows up because two faults just the two bedrocks, they are just come together and really raising up the material. And on the other hand, the strike slip fault, which is totally dominant in the Hengduan Mountains, shows the lateral movement of the landscape. And the GPS velocity can also show the same evidence that the whole landscape of the Hengduan Mountains, they are experiencing the clockwise rotation. And this rotation is mainly due to this Eurasia and the Indian collisions. So until now, you can, so at the geological time scale, we can still see the evidence of changing of the landscape. And another one is the bedrock map. And so it has very high diverse bedrock types and across the whole Hengduan Mountains. And apart from the geology, the climate in the Hengduan Mountains is also very unique. Here I present a bioclimate predictor called growing degree days. So it's a measure of heat accumulations, and it's more relevant to the species, to the plant growth. And here we can see a clear north-south gradient. And in the south, they have warmer climate, and they have a higher growing degree days. And another one I want to present is called set water balance. So it's an estimate of water availability to plants. And it's also reflect to the monsoon climate in the Hengduan Mountains. Actually, in the east and west of the Hengduan Mountains, you can see a very high set water balance. So that means the both South Asia monsoon and East Asia monsoon create a lot of rainfall in these regions. And on the biodiversity part, I use this species distribution model to map more than 10,000 plant species in the Hengduan Mountains. And after getting the species range for every single species, I can accumulate them to see where most species reach in the Hengduan Mountains. And they are actually most concentrated to the west of the Hengduan Mountains. So specifically, I asked the following 4 questions for my PhD studies. So the first is, how does habitat heterogeneity determine the richness pattern? And the second is, can the mountain ridge act as a dispersal barriers? And how the tectonic and the climate factors influence the plant biodiversity histories. And after these case studies, I want to summarize if there is a common framework to study these types of questions. So go to the first question. Here I use the Eurasia and Hengduan Mountains as a scale comparisons. And because I think Eurasia can be considered as a species pool and to say what species are living there. And this is the map from Kew Botanical Garden, and to show the Hengduan Mountains has a very high diversity. And as I think habitat heterogeneity is one of the main drivers for the biodiversity patterns, I need to find a way to calculate the biodiversity, the habitat heterogeneity. So here I use these climate variables I introduced before, the growing degrees, set water balance, and bedrock types. And I reclassify them and group them into different unique combinations. And then I can calculate how much heterogeneity they have in each polygons, and then this could be my main heterogeneity proxy at the Eurasia scale. So with this richness and heterogeneity data, I can build a model to say to what extent the habitat heterogeneity can explain the richness. So here, and I did that for every single families. And this is the relationship. And here we can see each blue dots represent a polygon in this richness map. So each blue dots are specific regions, specific mountains. And after construct this relationship, we did a quantile regressions and to reclassify these blue dots to see which region are fall in this richness heterogeneity relationship, and which region are go beyond this heterogeneity prediction. And then we call them as the outlier and non-outlier regions. And we specifically focus on the Hengduan Mountains to say for every single family, whether the Hengduan Mountains located in the outlier or non-outliers. If the Hengduan Mountains is located in this outlier region, we call this family as an outlier family. And if the Hengduan Mountains fall in this relationship, we call this as a non-outlier family. So our hypothesis is the heterogeneity is the first order driver for the species richness, but for certain families, it has a much more species richness than the heterogeneity prediction. That means another force is driving these families to have more diversity, and our hypotheses are built on some tectonic and geomorphic processes. So then we can classify the 97 families to these non-outlier and outlier families for the Hengduan Mountain region. And one example for this outlier family is the Iracaceae. And we know the famous rhododendron has very high biodiversity, and the main hotspot is in the Hengduan Mountains. And here at the family level, we can say it's highly concentrated in the Hengduan Mountains. And another non-outlier family is Apiaceae. And Hengduan Mountain has a pretty high diversity, but their hotspot is actually for in Turkey and Iran. And then we also color them in the phylogeny to see if they are showing some clustering patterns in the phylogeny, but actually they are randomly distributed, which may be a hint for some external forces to drive this biodiversity hotspot. And after that, we accumulate these outlier families and then to map the species richness patterns in the Hengduan Mountain scale. And here we can see where, for these outlier families, where they actually occur in the Hengduan Mountain scale. We do find that they have some spatial pattern, and especially in the West Hengduan Mountains. And then we recompute this heterogeneity matrix again, trying to explain the biodiversity pattern in the Hengduan Mountain scale. And what we found is the heterogeneity matrix that we developed has very good explanatory power for the richness pattern, but only one predictor can explain around 50% of the variations. However, there are still large residuals left, and these residual patterns shows some spatial coherence, and which may indicate some other processes, such as some tectonic geomorphic disruptions. So in conclusion, the habitat heterogeneity can be considered as a first-order process in driving the plant diversity patterns in the Hengduan Mountains, but there are large residual left, which may indicate other process. And then we zoom into the Hengduan Mountains to see if some landscape features can act as dispersal barriers for the species. And this is, then I zoom into the west of the Hengduan Mountains, and it's called the Three Rivers region because it has a much high diversity compared to other regions in the Hengduan Mountains. And the unique part of this region is we can see there are three rivers run in parallel with each other. And these paralleled rivers create high mountain ridges, and which may act as dispersal barriers, move east-westwards. And here I choose 30 tributaries and conduct the EDA field work. And so I just go to the outlet of the rivers and filter around 40-liter water, and then to check what exact plant and fungi communities in these tributaries. And so this is what families we found in this EDA approach. So it's not easy to see the proportion of these families, so, but I highlight several families that has more general has been detected. So here you can see it actually did a pretty good job to detect terrestrial plant species in the river EDA. So that means we just collect some water and we know what exact plants living in such environment. And this heat map shows what exact genus living in each tributaries of this Three River Valley. And here we can, so the pink means the species occur there, and this blue means the species does not occur. And here we can see there are some differences between the different river valleys. And when we know what exact species living there, we can get their habitat information from the floras. For instance, we can know which elevation band they tend to occur. And then we can accumulate all the species, all the genus we found in each basin, and together with their preferred elevation bands, and to map which elevation band they usually occur based on the species we found in the EDA. And on the other hand, we can map the total elevation range of the whole drainage basin. So here we can see there is a consistent shift towards lower elevation. So that means if we just sample at the outlet of the tributary, we can mainly detect these mid to low elevation species. So which is an ideal data for us to tell us if mountain ridge can be act as a dispersal barrier. And this one shows some PCOA plot to show the species compositions in different drainage basins. So if these basins have more similar color, that means they have more similar species to share. And we can see there are some differences between the different basins. And this is elevation profile together with the beta diversities. So to show if really crossing the big divide, we can see higher turnovers along this profile. I mean, there seems some trend, but it's very hard to distinguish. So that means we may need some more advanced approach to do that. And another problem of this kind of visualization is we're actually mixing with the climate and geological factors, because in the communities, we can say for instance, we can have lots of species in this species pool, but at the local scale, some species may be filtered out due to the different environments. And on the other hand, like they may have fewer species due to some dispersal limitations. And what we can see today is actually the species after these different processes. And how can we disentangle this fact? For instance, I want to know if the mountain ridge can act as a dispersal barrier. We know two communities in both sides of the mountain ridge. But on the one side, it has a lot of rain, and on the other side, it's pretty sunny. So they have different species, but we don't know if can be attributed to the climate or the mountain ridge as a dispersal barrier. But if we can manipulate the nature, we let both sides of the mountain ridge rain a lot, and then to see what communities they have. If both sides become very similar species compositions, that means climate is the main driver. And if they still show some differences after controlling the climate effect, so that may be an indicator that mountain ridge can act as a dispersal barrier. So we construct such model. We cannot do that because we cannot manipulate the nature, but we can build some models to test these hypotheses. So what I did is I used the plant compositions within the same river valley to construct a node model. So that means the differences between these communities is purely due to climate. And then I can predict this model to the communities across the river valley. And then we can make a model to say for this climate across the river valleys, and how the beta diversity would be if only climate plays a role. And then we can use this to compare with the observed data that we see today. And if the observed data is significantly higher than this predicted beta purely due to climate, we can say mountain ridge could be an effective barrier. If they just fall in this trend, they have no significant differences with the predicted beta due to climate differences. We have to say the mountain ridge is an ineffective barrier. So this is our result. We did that for the plant and fungi communities, and here we found the Salween Mekong divide is actually a very effective barrier, even after controlling the climatic effect on the other hand, another divide, the Mekong-Yangtze divide, is not a barrier after controlling the climatic effect. However, this conclusion is taxa dependent because when we look at the fungi communities and we found none of these ridges are the dispersal barrier. So in conclusion, the mountain ridge can act as a dispersal barrier, but it's totally taxa dependent. After controlling the climatic effects, the only plant species shows the Salween-Mekong divide can act as the dispersal barrier. And but all I talked before, they are only focused on the contemporary conditions, the climate or some geographies. And we know mountains has such a long history. We only can know how the biodiversity pattern look like after knowing the history well. So here I use some very high, some clades that are highly diversified in the Hengduan Mountains, and with their very high resolution range maps to construct biogeographic realms. So that means in this, I split the whole landscape into different subregions. And within each region, they will have more similar species composition and the phylogenetic relationships. And after that, we can ask what controls the spatial pattern of these biogeographic realms. So we can randomly choose the pairs between the realms to say how much turnover they have. And then we can also see in this, for instance, this A and B, and can also to calculate the climate distance between these two dots. And then we can also use some geography metrics called least cost path, which shows the connectivity of the landscape to show how far away does the species need to travel from one point to another. And then we can build models to explain if the climate or the geographic isolations contribute to these realm patterns. And here is a result. So I split the Hengduan Mountains into 8 realms, and above you can see the relationship between these realms. And on the right panel, I show like to what extent these climate and geographic isolations contribute to these realm segregations. So what we found is for these realms are segregated between north and south, climate is a dominant driver. Well, for these realms segregate between east and west, actually the geographic isolation is the main driver. So that's pretty interesting because we can see a lot of climatic gradient from north to south. And on the other hand, this fault map and also the mountain ridges in the Hengduan Mountains, they locate from north to south. That means they act as dispersal barriers to impede species travel from east westwards. And these realms, they have a very similar evolutionary relationship, and then I can reconstruct their evolutionary relationship together with some historical and geological data. And one matrix I use here is from low temperature thermochronometry. So it means how fast the mountain grow, and they are measures some some rock uplift rate, and but but here, like, how can we correlate this with about biodiversity data? So here in my study, we developed some metrics that are more meaningful for the biodiversity. So for instance, in the steady state, we can say mountains are just keep the exact same shape, but that means that does not mean mountain does not grow. It's actually this steady state is due to a balance between the tectonic forcing and the erosion rate. So if these two forces are balanced, that means the mountain don't goes up. But on the other, in different time period, when there is a shift in this in the tectonic forcing or the erosion rate, and the mountains will goes up or have deeply incised down. And this record can be found in this thermochronometry data. And on the other hand, the landscape has also lots of lateral movement. That means if a mountain ridge have a different erosion rate in both sides of the ridges, so that means their ridge may be moved laterally through time. That does not necessarily mean the mountain goes higher or lower. It's just they have their own dynamics without changing the total elevation. And these two proxies may have impact on the plant diversification history. And so here is the data for the thermochronometry. And my colleague did that from 30 MA until now. And so here you can see the more reddish color means they have a higher erosion rate. And the Hengduan Mountains has relatively short history, but in the east of the Hengduan Mountains, here the Longmenshan region, they have relatively longer history. You can see there are some hotspots in this thermochron data exist even at 30 MA, and then until recently they becomes they are having higher and higher erosion rate. And so one evidence we can see today is there are a lot of earthquakes in the Sichuan province, and which may due to these tectonic activities. And on the west of the Hengduan Mountains, it's actually pretty quiet until recent 10 MA, and they have even more homogeneous of the erosion rate. So there is differences in geological history of the Hengduan Mountains. The east has a longer history and more complex tectonic activities. And on the other hand, I also compute some biodiversity metrics. For instance, the species loss divergence time from the phylogenies. And it shows in the east, they are harboring more ancient species than the rest of the Hengduan Mountains. And I also compute a matrix. I call this as a tau age by making this species accumulation curve. I can say how fast the species accumulate through time. And I developed this age matrix, which shows if the species accumulation history is longer or shorter. And in this tau age, we also found in the east of the Hengduan Mountains, it has a much longer history. And then we just made very simple correlations between these two metrics. So the X is the erosion history, and the Y is this age matrix. And we found almost perfect correlations between these two. So they both shows in the Hengduan Mountains, the regions with longer geological history, and they are harboring species with longer, harboring older species. And this Tau age also performed pretty good. And to say this maybe longer geological history can stimulate, and this landscape changes, longer landscape changes history can stimulate the longer diversification history of the plants. So here I conclude the climate and the geographic isolation can jointly influences division, and the tectonic histories is associated with these realm histories. So from these three case studies, what we can learn from it, and can we make a framework to partition the biodiversity patterns between the environmental factors and tectono-geomorphic factors? Yes, we could do that. So first step, we need to build up high biodiversity patterns. And it could be based on purely the species data or with some phylogenetic relationships. And step two, we need to account for these climatic factors, both like current climate or the paleoclimate, like the glaciations. Because here you can see like they have a lot of glaciers during LGM, and that may cause this low diversity in the north of the Hengduan Mountains. And step three, we need to find a way to account for these climatic factors. And here I'm just assume this heterogeneity, which integrate climate and bedrock types, they are the main driver. And then we account for this effect and can calculate some residuals of this model. And then we need to find a way to explain the pattern we left after controlling this climatic effect. But I would say it's a grand challenge, and we are still at the very beginning of this journey. So yes, we could do that to build up this framework and first identify the pattern and account for the climate impacts, and then to explore some other processes like the tectono-geomorphic drivers. So in conclusion, here I proved the habitat heterogeneity is the first order process in driving species richness pattern, and the physical location of the mountain ridges can act as a dispersal barriers. But it's totally taxa and location dependent. And the climate and the geographic isolations jointly influence the division of the biogeographic realms, and the tectonic history is associated with the realm history. And last, we can have a framework to disentangle these questions and trying to have a better understanding of the tectonic and geomorphic drivers. And finally, I would like to thank all my colleagues and supervisors and collaborators in the world. And so because it's a very interdisciplinary project, we had a lot of collaborations and discussions with geologists and climatologists, and within ETH and also beyond ETH. And I would also like to thank my cat to have me to survive to survive in this PhD journey, which is pretty tough to bridging these disciplines. Okay, thank you all. Thanks for the listening.
Great, thank you. We have time for questions.
Great talk. I was wondering if you'd comment a little bit on kind of the role of the lowlands from a botanical perspective and how much of a role that plays in what's available to disperse into the mountains.
Oh, you mean just if I understand correctly, you mean just so the species from this lowland, how much they evolve crossing the elevations and to the high plateaus?
Yeah, and potentially vice versa
Yeah, yeah.
if that happens.
Yeah, I see your point, and I would say it's not easy to understand this from the approach I used. And I guess the model Rick developed can understand this kind of question better. But we did have some discussions and about this topic. And one idea is it's just some test hypothesis. We want to know, for instance, this West Hengduan Mountains, they have very high ridges, and there are two hypotheses to about the landscape. So one is it's used to be very high, and then the river started to incise it. And on the other hand, it's this region is pretty low, and then they have a lot, the mountains grows up. And to have these two hypotheses in the geology part, maybe we can build up some biodiversity models, and then to reclassify the floras we see in different elevation band, and then to reconstruct their evolutionary history to see how they dispersed or how they evolved either from lowland to highland or highland to lowland. And then maybe we can also compare with these geological hypotheses and to have a better understanding of how this landscape shapes the biodiversity there. Yeah, but I would say this is currently some ideas that we are discussing and trying to test. But for this exact mechanism, so far I don't have a very clear answer yet.
Just to echo what John said, that was a really great talk. Thank you. I had a two-part question about the fungi versus plants. And I was curious, you're noticing that that the fungi seem much more widespread and there wasn't as much subdivision as you were observing with the plants. Is that just a function of spore size being small versus in comparison to seeds, do you think? And then my follow-up is, did you try subdividing the fungi into ecological guilds at all, like wood rotters versus mycorrhizal, and kind of look at it that way as well?
I see. Yeah, maybe this spawn size could be an explanation. And so far we don't have very clear explanation about these segregations. But maybe one point I haven't mentioned in my talk is because from the EDA, we have very varied taxonomic resolutions. And for the fungi community, we detected them at family level. And for the plant species, we detected them at a genus level. So maybe these taxonomic differences can cause the pattern. If I'm able to detect fungi at genus level, maybe we can say some barriers exist. And also about these functional types, because I'm not a fungi expert, and I didn't make this clear reclassification about what types of fungi I found. But I do have some very coarse classifications. It's just a show in the Southern River, the most western river, it has more, the fungi may be more warm environment. But I can show you the exact data later. Yeah.
I have a question. So yeah, so continuing on this the eDNA. So, yeah, I confess I'm a little skeptical about, how effective eDNA in the rivers, in the tributaries, like what kind of signal the eDNA holds about dispersal, in terms of like dispersal barriers, because I mean, you have a very fine scale, you have fine scale species distribution data at this point, right? For the whole flora, for the whole region. And so I mean, it seems to me if you want to test the hypothesis that like, river valleys are dispersal barriers, you either look for just, turnover, right, in species occurrence, or like, genetic evidence of, uh, dispersal barriers. Yeah, because I noticed that like when you showed like what plants you were able to detect in the rivers, like it was a really small subset of obviously the plants that were actually there, and I feel like you could, isn't it much more direct just to kind of look at what plants occur on each side of the river? I don't know, or am I not seeing this correctly, or?
I see your point. And for me, it's kind of opposite because I have this very high resolution biodiversity map from species distribution model, but actually it may be not as high as I expected, because the original input of this biodiversity map is the species distributions at county level. So a county in China is 50 kilometer by 50 kilometer squares. So it's very big. And then when I use the elevation information to cut it, it just shows in this county which elevation band the species do occur. But for me, the dispersal barrier is in a finer scale. So it may has a very similar environment, but this dispersal barrier may impede species disperse even within the same environment. So that means actually from my species distribution model, and I saw just like a lot of species shared by all three valleys, all three river valleys. I cannot say the taxonomic differences. And so that's why I'm going to conduct this EDA field work, because it's easier and to say what species located in each valley. And of course, I can just do some traditional community service, just go to this valley and to record what species exact locate. But it's much more time consuming and for in this traditional service. And the EDA, I just need to go to the river and wait for 1 or 2 hours for the water filtration, and then I can already get the data. So it's a more cost efficient and time efficient approach. But I would say the EDA, because it's just it's still a very new area, and the resolution of the taxa we detect is highly dependent on the reference database. So if we don't have the reference genome, maybe we are not be able to detect it. And also from my studies, we found these floras, we found that they are actually somehow close to the river, and maybe their pollens or leaves or flowers just fall into the river, and then we are able to collect them and to get some DNA data. So I would say it's, I mean, the best scenario is to have the plot level data for everywhere, and then we can see the pattern better. But on the other hand, it's so difficult to do that. So I would say it's a kind of a more efficient way, but maybe less accurate for now, but I believe in the future, maybe we can have better and better data set.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, let's thank Yaquan again.
So thank you.